Sarah Martinez had always been afraid of flying, but her job as a medical equipment sales representative demanded frequent travel. On that crisp October morning in 2018, she stood at Gate 47 in Denver International Airport, clutching her boarding pass for Flight 2847 to Phoenix. The routine business trip was supposed to be simple: a 2-hour flight, a quick presentation to a hospital procurement team, and back home by evening to her apartment in Boulder, Colorado. The Boeing 737 looked imposing on the tarmac as passengers slowly filed aboard. Sarah found her window seat in row 12, settling in with her laptop bag and the familiar knot of anxiety that accompanied every takeoff. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing the standard business attire that marked her as just another traveling professional. Nothing about her appearance suggested she would soon become the most important person on that aircraft. Captain Robert Bob Henderson had been flying commercial jets for 22 years. His co-pilot, First Officer Jessica Chen, was relatively new but sharp and methodical. Together, they completed their pre-flight checks with the practiced efficiency of experienced aviators. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, and all systems showed green across the board. Flight 2847 was scheduled to depart at 8:15 a.m. Mountain Time, and everything appeared routine. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Sarah gripped her armrests and tried to focus on her breathing exercises. The businessman beside her was already absorbed in his tablet, while across the aisle, a mother was trying to keep her toddler entertained with picture books. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration with professional smiles, their voices calm and reassuring over the intercom. The takeoff was smooth, and Sarah began to relax slightly as Denver's sprawling metropolitan area fell away beneath them. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly to the west, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sunlight. She opened her laptop to review her presentation slides once more, losing herself in technical specifications for MRI machines and CT scanners. What Sarah didn't know was that approximately 200 miles to the southwest, at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Air Force Captain Mike Rodriguez was settling into his F-16 Fighting Falcon for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Rodriguez, call sign Viper, was a seasoned pilot with over 500 hours in the F-16 and numerous deployments under his belt. His wingman, Captain Lisa Phoenix Thompson, occupied the second F-16 on the tarmac. The training mission was straightforward: practice intercept procedures and defensive maneuvers in the designated military airspace over southern Colorado. Both pilots had completed similar exercises dozens of times, and the clear weather conditions made it an ideal day for flight operations. As they went through their pre-flight procedures, neither pilot anticipated that their routine training would soon become a real-world emergency. At 9:42 a.m., approximately 87 minutes into Flight 2847's journey, Captain Henderson noticed something unusual on his instruments. The aircraft's autopilot system began making subtle corrections that weren't consistent with the programmed flight path. Initially, these deviations were minor, barely perceptible to the passengers, but Henderson's experienced eye caught the anomaly immediately. "Jess, are you seeing this?" Henderson asked his co-pilot, pointing to the flight management system display. First Officer Chen leaned over to examine the readings. "The autopilot seems to be compensating for something. Wind shear maybe?" But Henderson knew the weather conditions were too stable for wind shear to cause these kinds of corrections. He switched off the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft, immediately feeling unusual resistance in the control yoke. The Boeing 737 was subtly but persistently pulling to the left, requiring constant pressure to maintain course. In the passenger cabin, Sarah was deep in thought about her upcoming presentation when she felt the aircraft make a slightly sharper turn than usual. Most passengers didn't notice, but her heightened anxiety about flying made her acutely aware of every movement. She glanced out the window and noticed they seemed to be descending gradually, though the seatbelt sign remained off and no announcement had been made. Captain Henderson's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue and we'll be making a slight course adjustment. We expect to arrive in Phoenix only a few minutes behind schedule. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible turbulence." The announcement sent a chill through Sarah's stomach. minor technical issue was airline speak for something potentially serious. She watched the flight attendants secure loose items in the galley, their movements efficient but urgent. The businessman beside her continued working on his tablet, apparently unconcerned, but Sarah noticed the mother across the aisle was holding her child more tightly. In the cockpit, Henderson and Chen were working through their emergency checklists. The flight control anomaly was becoming more pronounced, and Henderson was having to apply increasing pressure to keep the aircraft on course. They had declared a pan-pan with air traffic control, indicating an urgent situation that didn't yet require declaring a full emergency. Denver Center, Southwest 2847, were experiencing flight control irregularities and requesting vectors to the nearest suitable airport, Henderson transmitted. Southwest 2847, Denver Center, Roger. Are you declaring an emergency? Henderson hesitated for a moment. Negative emergency at this time, but we'd like priority handling and emergency services standing by. Meanwhile, at Peterson Air Force Base, Captain Rodriguez and Captain Thompson had completed their takeoff and were climbing to their assigned altitude for the training exercise. The F-16s were sleek and powerful, their engines roaring as they climbed through the thin mountain air. Both pilots were focused on their mission parameters when an unexpected transmission came through their secure radio frequency. Viper, Phoenix, this is Mountain Home Control. We're interrupting your training exercise. We have a possible intercept mission developing. Stand by for further instructions. Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission while his mind shifted gears from training mode to operational readiness. Intercept missions could range from escorting lost aircraft to responding to potential threats to national airspace. His training and experience kicked in automatically as he awaited further details. Viper, Phoenix, Mountain Home Control. We have a commercial aircraft, Southwest 2847, experiencing control difficulties approximately 40 miles northeast of your current position. Aircraft is not responding normally to pilot inputs and may be experiencing some form of control system malfunction or interference. You are tasked with visual intercept and assessment. The gravity of the situation hit both pilots immediately. A commercial airliner with control problems was every pilot's nightmare, whether military or civilian. Rodriguez could feel his heartbeat accelerate slightly as he acknowledged the mission and began coordinating with his wingman to intercept Flight 2847. Back aboard the Southwest flight, Captain Henderson was fighting increasingly difficult flight controls. The aircraft was pulling harder to the left, and maintaining altitude was becoming a challenge. The Boeing 737 was still flyable, but barely, and Henderson knew they needed to get on the ground as soon as possible. Denver Center, Southwest 2847, were declaring an emergency now. We have significant flight control problems and need immediate vectors to the closest airport capable of handling a 737. Southwest 2847, emergency declared. Turn left heading 270, descend and maintain flight level 240. Colorado Springs Airport is 38 miles at your 11 o'clock position, runway 17 right is available, winds light and variable. Henderson acknowledged and began the left turn, fighting the aircraft's tendency to overbank as he descended toward Colorado Springs. In the passenger cabin, the change in the aircraft's attitude was now noticeable to everyone. Conversations died down as passengers sensed something was wrong. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the armrests. Through her window, she could see the ground growing larger, and the aircraft felt different, like a car with a flat tire struggling to stay on the road. She closed her laptop and tried to remember the safety briefing, though her mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced calm, but Sarah could see the tension in their faces. Lead flight attendant Maria Santos had been flying for 15 years and had experienced various emergencies, but this felt different. The subtle but persistent rolling motion of the aircraft suggested a serious problem with the flight controls. As Captain Rodriguez guided his F-16 toward the intercept coordinates, he could see the Southwest Boeing 737 in the distance, its white fuselage and blue tail clearly visible against the brown landscape below. Even from several miles away, he could observe that the aircraft's flight path was slightly erratic, confirming the reported control difficulties. Phoenix, Viper has visual contact with Southwest 2847. Aircraft appears to be maintaining controlled flight but with visible control inputs. Closing to visual inspection distance. Rodriguez positioned his F-16 carefully, approaching the airliner from below and behind to avoid startling the passengers or crew. As he drew closer, he could see the Boeing 737's control surfaces moving constantly, evidence of the pilot's struggle to maintain stable flight. The aircraft was definitely in distress, but it was still flying. Inside Flight 2847's cockpit, Captain Henderson heard an unexpected transmission on the emergency frequency, Southwest 2847, this is Air Force Viper on guard frequency. I have you in sight and am conducting a visual assessment of your aircraft. Please acknowledge. Henderson looked out his left window and was surprised to see an F-16 Fighting Falcon flying in loose formation with his airliner. The fighter jet's presence was both reassuring and alarming, confirming that their situation was serious enough to warrant military intervention. Air Force Viper, Southwest 2847, we copy your transmission. We're experiencing severe flight control anomalies and are diverting to Colorado Springs. Any assessment you can provide would be appreciated. Rodriguez carefully examined the Boeing 737's exterior, looking for any obvious signs of damage or malfunction. The control surfaces appeared intact, but he could see the constant movement of the elevators and rudder as the pilot fought to maintain control. More concerning was what appeared to be unusual air disturb around the aircraft's tail section. Southwest 2847, Viper. Your aircraft appears structurally intact from my vantage point, but I'm observing unusual airflow patterns around your empennage. Recommend you maintain current configuration and continue approach to Colorado Springs. Emergency services are being alerted. In the passenger cabin, several people had noticed the F-16 flying alongside them. Word spread quickly through the aircraft, and passengers began looking out the windows on the left side. Sarah pressed her face to her window and could clearly see the military fighter jet, its pilot's helmet visible in the cockpit. The sight was both thrilling and terrifying. The businessman beside Sarah finally put down his tablet and looked out the window. That's an F-16, he said quietly. They don't send those for minor technical issues. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Her worst fears about flying seemed to be materializing, but somehow the presence of the fighter jet was oddly comforting. Someone was watching over them, someone with the skills and equipment to help if needed. As Flight 2847 continued its emergency descent toward Colorado Springs, Captain Henderson was growing more concerned about the aircraft's handling characteristics. The control problems were worsening, and he was having to use both hands on the yoke to maintain heading and altitude. Co-pilot Chen was running through emergency checklists and coordinating with air traffic control, but they both knew they were in a race against time. Denver Center, Southwest 2847, we need emergency equipment standing by. We're having difficulty controlling the aircraft and may need assistance upon landing. Southwest 2847, emergency services are being notified. Colorado Springs Airport is clearing runway 17 right and positioning crash rescue equipment. Winds are calm, visibility unrestricted. The Boeing 737 was now clearly struggling through the air, its flight path erratic despite Henderson's best efforts. Captain Rodriguez, still flying formation in his F-16, could see the airliner's control surfaces working overtime as the pilot fought to maintain control. The situation was deteriorating, and Rodriguez knew that whatever was causing the control problems was getting worse. Mountain Home Control, Viper. Southwest 2847's condition is worsening. I'm observing increased control surface deflection and irregular flight path. Recommend expedited approach and landing. As they descended below 10,000 feet, the ground began to fill Sarah's window. She could see highways and buildings, and, in the distance, the runway at Colorado Springs Airport. Fire trucks and ambulances were visible along the taxiways, their red and white forms looking tiny from altitude but representing hope and safety. The aircraft shuddered as Captain Henderson lowered the landing gear, the additional drag making the control problems even more pronounced. In the cabin, passengers could feel the difference in the aircraft's behavior. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by an anxious silence broken only by the occasional crying of children. Flight attendant Maria Santos made her way to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your seats are in the upright position. We will be landing shortly in Colorado Springs. Please listen carefully to any instructions from the flight crew." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray, though she couldn't remember the words. Beside her, the businessman was gripping his armrest just as tightly as she was. Across the aisle, the mother was whispering reassurances to her child while clearly fighting her own fear. Captain Rodriguez watched from his F-16 as the Boeing 737 lined up for final approach. The airliner was still flying, but its pilot was clearly fighting every inch of the way. As they descended through 3,000 feet, Rodriguez could see the airport emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the afternoon sun. What none of them knew was that this emergency landing was just the beginning of Sarah Martinez's extraordinary story. In the coming minutes and hours, the quiet medical equipment saleswoman would find herself at the center of a crisis that would test not only her courage but also reveal capabilities she never knew she possessed. The F-16 pilot who now watched over their descent would soon know her by a different name entirely, Eagle One. The Boeing 737 touched down hard on runway 17 right at Colorado Springs Airport, bouncing once before settling onto the concrete with a screech of tires and the roar of reverse thrusters. Captain Henderson fought to keep the aircraft centered on the runway as it rolled out, the control problems that had plagued them in flight continuing to make steering difficult. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon in urgent colors. Sarah Martinez felt her body press forward against her seatbelt as the aircraft decelerated rapidly. Through her window, she could see fire trucks keeping pace with their aircraft, foam cannons at the ready. The sight should have been terrifying, but, after the stress of the emergency descent, the solid feeling of ground beneath them was overwhelmingly reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," came Captain Henderson's voice over the intercom, slightly strained but professional. "We're going to taxi clear of the runway and park at a gate where emergency personnel can inspect the aircraft. Thank you for your patience during this emergency." The aircraft came to a stop on a remote taxiway, surrounded by emergency vehicles. Through the cockpit windows, Captain Henderson and First Officer Chen could see ground personnel approaching with various pieces of diagnostic equipment. The immediate crisis was over, but the mystery of what had caused their control problems remained unsolved. Captain Rodriguez's F-16 made a low pass over the airport before heading back to Peterson Air Force Base. His mission was complete for now, but something about the incident bothered him. Commercial aircraft didn't just develop severe control problems without cause, and the unusual airflow patterns he'd observed around the Boeing 737's tail section suggested something more complex than a simple mechanical failure. In the passenger cabin, relief was mixed with confusion. The flight attendants were coordinating with ground personnel through the aircraft's communication systems, but passengers were told to remain seated pending inspection of the aircraft. Sarah finally released her death grip on the armrests and realized her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "That was something else," said the businessman beside her, whose name she learned was David Chen, ironically no relation to their co-pilot. 20 years of business travel, and I've never experienced anything like that." Sarah nodded, finding her voice for the first time since the emergency began. "I'm just glad we're on the ground in one piece. I hate flying under the best circumstances." What they didn't know was that ground personnel were already making a disturbing discovery. Lead mechanic Thomas Rodriguez, no relation to the F-16 pilot, was conducting his initial visual inspection when he noticed something unusual about the aircraft's elevator trim tabs. The small control surfaces that help maintain the aircraft's pitch attitude showed signs of electronic interference. "Control Tower, Ground Maintenance 1, Thomas spoke into his radio. I'm seeing some anomalies with the elevator trim system on Southwest 2847. Recommend we get an electronics specialist out here before we move this aircraft to a gate." The tower controller acknowledged the request and immediately began coordinating with the airport's technical support team. What had started as a routine emergency landing was becoming something more complex and potentially concerning. Inside the aircraft, passengers were growing restless after 30 minutes of waiting. The initial relief of landing safely was giving way to anxiety about missed connections, cancelled meetings, and the unknown duration of their delay. Flight attendant Maria Santos moved through the cabin, providing updates and trying to keep everyone calm. "We expect to have you to a gate within the next hour," she announced. "The ground crew is conducting some additional safety checks before we can taxi to the terminal. We appreciate your patience." Sarah used the time to call her office and reschedule her afternoon presentation. As she spoke with her manager, she noticed activity outside her window that seemed more intense than a typical mechanical inspection. Several unmarked vehicles had arrived, and personnel in civilian clothes were examining the aircraft alongside the regular maintenance crew. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an electronics systems specialist from the Federal Aviation Administration, had been dispatched from Denver as soon as preliminary reports suggested electronic anomalies. She arrived at Colorado Springs Airport 2 hours after the emergency landing and immediately began working with the ground crew to understand what had happened to Flight 2847. "Show me what you found," Dr. Walsh told lead mechanic Thomas Rodriguez as they stood beneath the aircraft's tail section. Thomas pointed to the elevator trim tab actuators. "These systems show signs of electromagnetic interference. The control circuits have been fluctuating, which would explain the flight control problems," the crew reported. Dr. Walsh connected her diagnostic equipment to the aircraft's systems and immediately saw concerning readings. The electronic signatures suggested external interference rather than internal system failure. Someone or something had been electronically attacking the aircraft's flight control systems. "We need to notify Homeland Security immediately," Dr. Walsh said quietly to the ground crew supervisor. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone was actively interfering with this aircraft's control systems. The realization sent a chill through the small group of technicians and officials gathered around the Boeing 737. If someone was electronically attacking commercial aircraft, it represented a threat to aviation security that went far beyond a simple emergency landing. Back at Peterson Air Force Base, Captain Rodriguez was debriefing his intercept mission with his squadron commander, Colonel Sarah Williams. The routine training exercise turned real-world emergency was being documented and analyzed, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. "Sir, the airflow disturbances I observed around that 737 weren't consistent with any mechanical failure I've ever seen," Rodriguez reported. "The control surfaces were responding, but the aircraft was fighting some kind of external influence." Colonel Williams made notes in the mission report. "Electronic warfare interference? That's what I'm thinking, sir." If someone was jamming or spoofing the aircraft's control systems, it would explain the symptoms, the crew reported. The colonel looked up from her notes with a serious expression. "Captain, I want you to prepare for possible follow-up missions. If this was electronic warfare against civilian aircraft, we may need to establish protective patrols." Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez and her fellow passengers were finally being transferred to the terminal via bus. The aircraft remained on the remote taxiway, now surrounded by even more vehicles and personnel. As their bus pulled away, Sarah couldn't help but notice the serious expressions on the faces of the officials examining their aircraft. At the terminal, passengers were being interviewed individually by a mix of FAA investigators, airline personnel, and what appeared to be federal law enforcement agents. When Sarah's turn came, she found herself sitting across from Agent Rebecca Torres of the Department of Homeland Security and FAA investigator Dr. Jennifer Walsh. "Ms. Martinez, we understand this experience was frightening," Agent Torres began. "We're trying to understand exactly what happened during your flight. Did you notice anything unusual before the emergency was declared?" Sarah thought back to the flight. "I'm always nervous when I fly, so I pay attention to every little thing. The aircraft seemed to be making small corrections throughout the flight, even before the captain announced any problems." Dr. Walsh leaned forward with interest. "Can you be more specific about these corrections?" "Well, I felt like we were being pushed around by wind, but it was a clear day. The aircraft would bank slightly left, then right, then left again. It was subtle, but I noticed because I was already anxious about flying." The investigators exchanged glances. Sarah's observations aligned with their growing theory that Flight 2847 had been under electronic attack for much longer than initially realized. Someone had been testing the aircraft's responses before escalating to more serious interference. "Ms. Martinez, did you notice any passengers acting unusually? Anyone paying particular attention to the aircraft's movements or using electronic devices in ways that seemed odd?" Sarah thought carefully. Most passengers had been absorbed in their own activities, but there was something that nagged at her. "There was a man 3 rows behind me who seemed very interested in his tablet, but he wasn't reading or watching videos. The screen looked different, more like graphs or technical displays." Agent Torres made detailed notes. "Can you describe this individual?" "Middle-aged, maybe late 40s, wearing a dark business suit. He had short brown hair and was clean-shaven. He boarded late and seemed nervous, but not the usual flight anxiety. More like he was worried about something specific." The description would later prove crucial to the investigation, but, at that moment, Sarah had no idea she had just provided the first solid lead in what would become a major national security investigation. As the interviews concluded, passengers were told they would need to stay in Colorado Springs overnight while the investigation continued. The airline provided hotel accommodations and meal vouchers, but many travelers were frustrated by the delay and the lack of detailed explanation about what had happened. Sarah found herself assigned to the same hotel as several other passengers, including David Chen and the mother with the toddler, whose name was Amanda Foster. Over dinner in the hotel restaurant, they discussed their shared experience and tried to make sense of what had happened. "That wasn't just a mechanical problem," David said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Did you see how many federal agents were at the airport? And they kept asking about other passengers, not just about the flight itself." Amanda nodded while cutting food for her 2-year-old son, Marcus. "The way they asked about electronic devices and suspicious behavior, it sounded like they think someone on the plane caused what happened." Sarah felt a chill as she considered the implications. If someone on their flight had deliberately caused the control problems, they had all been unwitting victims of what amounted to an aerial attack. The thought made her grateful all over again for the skill of their pilots and the intervention of the F-16 escort. That evening, as Sarah tried to sleep in her hotel room, she couldn't stop thinking about the man with the tablet. Something about his behavior had struck her as odd even during the flight, though she hadn't been able to articulate why until the investigators asked their questions. Now, replaying the scene in her mind, she remembered other details, the way he had quickly closed his tablet when the flight attendant walked by, and how he had seemed to be timing something on his device. Unknown to Sarah, her observations were proving invaluable to the investigation. Federal agents were already working to identify the passenger she had described, using flight manifests and security footage from Denver International Airport. The man's identity, when discovered, would reveal a connection to a sophisticated group of hackers with ties to hostile foreign governments. But the investigation was also uncovering something unexpected. Flight 2847 had not been a random target. Analysis of the electronic attack patterns suggested that whoever had interfered with the aircraft's systems had been specifically testing responses and capabilities. The flight had been chosen as a probe of American aviation security systems, a trial run for something much larger. At Peterson Air Force Base, Colonel Williams was briefing her superiors on the day's events and the growing evidence that Flight 2847 had been the victim of electronic warfare. The implications were staggering. If hostile actors could remotely interfere with commercial aircraft control systems, the entire aviation industry was at risk. "We need to establish protective protocols immediately," Colonel Williams reported to the base commander. "If this was a test run, we can expect escalated attacks on high-value targets." The base commander authorized increased readiness levels and began coordinating with other Air Force installations across the country. Fighter aircraft would be placed on alert status, ready to escort and protect commercial flights if additional attacks occurred. Captain Rodriguez was selected to lead the development of new intercept and protection procedures specifically designed to counter electronic warfare attacks on civilian aircraft. His experience with Flight 2847 made him uniquely qualified to understand both the threat and the response requirements. Back in Colorado Springs, Sarah was awakened at 2 a.m. by a knock on her hotel room door. Agent Torres stood in the hallway with 2 other federal investigators. "Ms. Martinez, we apologize for the late hour, but we need your help with something urgent." We've identified the passenger you described, and we believe he may be planning additional attacks. Would you be willing to assist us? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. The nervous businessman with the unusual tablet was apparently a serious security threat, and somehow her observations had helped identify him. The simple business trip she had dreaded that morning had become something far more significant. What kind of assistance do you need? Sarah asked, pulling on her robe and stepping into the hallway. Agent Torres explained that the suspect, identified as Viktor Kozlov, was believed to be planning attacks on multiple commercial flights. The electronic signatures from Flight 2847 had provided crucial intelligence about his methods, but stopping him would require more than just technical analysis. Mr. Kozlov uses commercial flights to test and refine his attack systems. We need someone who can observe and report his activities without raising suspicion. Someone who looks like an ordinary passenger. The implications hit Sarah immediately. They were asking her to become some kind of undercover operative, using her experience as a frequent business traveler to help catch a dangerous criminal. The idea was both terrifying and strangely compelling. Why me specifically? Sarah asked. Because you noticed what trained security personnel missed, Agent Torres replied. You have the observational skills and the cover story we need. Plus, Mr. Kozlov doesn't know that you identified him, so you can operate without suspicion. As Sarah stood in the hotel hallway at 2 a.m., still trying to process everything that had happened since her routine business trip began, she had no idea that her answer would transform her from a nervous passenger into Eagle One, one of the most important assets in a classified operation to protect American aviation from electronic warfare attacks. The next phase of her story was about to begin, and it would test not only her courage but also skills she never knew she possessed. 3 weeks after agreeing to help federal investigators, Sarah Martinez found herself aboard another commercial flight, but this time her nervous energy had nothing to do with her fear of flying. Seated 6 rows behind Viktor Kozlov on United Flight 1847 from Chicago to Los Angeles, she maintained careful observation while appearing to be just another business traveler absorbed in her laptop. The transformation had been remarkable. In just 21 days, Sarah had received intensive training from a joint task force of FBI, Homeland Security, and Air Force personnel. She learned surveillance techniques, electronic communication protocols, and, most importantly, how to recognize the subtle signs of electronic warfare attacks on aircraft systems. Agent Torres had become her primary handler, teaching her to use sophisticated monitoring equipment disguised as ordinary business electronics. Sarah's laptop bag now contained devices that could detect electromagnetic anomalies and record electronic signatures that might indicate attempted interference with aircraft systems. Remember Eagle One, Agent Torres had said during their final briefing, using the call sign the F-16 pilots had suggested for Sarah, your job is to observe and report. Do not attempt to intervene directly. Your safety is our primary concern. The call sign had stuck because of Captain Rodriguez's recommendation. After learning about Sarah's recruitment into the operation, he had suggested that someone who had survived an electronic attack on a commercial airliner deserved a pilot's call sign. Eagle One seemed appropriate for someone who would be watching over other flights from within. Viktor Kozlov appeared to be an ordinary business traveler, working quietly on what looked like financial spreadsheets. But Sarah's trained eye caught details that would have escaped notice before her crash course in surveillance. The device he was using looked like a standard tablet, but it had additional ports and antenna modifications that suggested far more sophisticated capabilities. More telling were his behavioral patterns. Kozlov glanced at his watch frequently and seemed to be timing his activities with remarkable precision. Every 15 minutes, he would manipulate his device in a specific sequence, then return to his apparent spreadsheet work. Sarah recognized the pattern from her training. He was conducting systematic probes of the aircraft's electronic systems. Through her concealed communication device, Sarah whispered updates to the ground support team. Eagle One to base. Subject is active. Timing patterns consistent with electronic probing. Beginning documentation sequence. Sarah activated her hidden recording equipment and began capturing electromagnetic signatures from Kozlov's device. The technology she carried was cutting edge, developed specifically for this operation by a joint team of Air Force and FBI technicians. It could detect and record the specific frequencies and patterns used in electronic attacks on aviation systems. Captain Rodriguez was flying escort in an F-16 roughly 20 miles off the flight path, ready to intervene if Kozlov's activities escalated beyond passive probing. The military had developed new protocols since the Flight 2847 incident, including covert air support for flights carrying known electronic warfare threats. Mountain Home Control, Viper 2-1, maintaining protective overwatch on United 1847. Eagle 1 reports subject is active but no immediate threat indicators. The ground control team included specialists from multiple agencies, all coordinated by Colonel Williams, who had been placed in charge of the Joint Task Force addressing electronic threats to aviation. The operation represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between civilian and military authorities. Viper 2-1, Mountain Home Control, understood. Continue overwatch. Eagle 1 has authorization to proceed with documentation phase. Inside the aircraft, Sarah was capturing invaluable intelligence. Her equipment recorded not only the electromagnetic signatures from Kozlov's attacks but also the aircraft's responses to his probes. This data would allow engineers to develop better countermeasures and help pilots recognize when their aircraft was under electronic attack. What Sarah observed over the next hour was deeply troubling. Kozlov wasn't just testing random systems, he was methodically mapping the aircraft's electronic vulnerabilities with the precision of a military intelligence operation. His probes targeted navigation systems, flight management computers, and, most concerning of all, the fly-by-wire flight control systems. Eagle 1 to base, Sarah whispered during a bathroom break where she could speak more freely. Pattern analysis suggests comprehensive vulnerability assessment. Subject appears to be mapping all major flight systems. Agent Torres responded through Sarah's concealed earpiece. Eagle 1, understood. Continue documentation. Be advised that similar activities have been detected on 3 other flights this week. The revelation that Kozlov was part of a larger coordinated effort made Sarah's stomach tighten. If multiple operatives were simultaneously probing different flights, the scope of the threat was far greater than anyone had initially realized. Back at her seat, Sarah noticed that Kozlov's activities were becoming more aggressive. The subtle corrections she had learned to recognize as signs of electronic interference were becoming more pronounced. The aircraft was beginning to respond to his attacks just as Flight 2847 had 3 weeks earlier. Sarah discreetly activated her emergency communication protocol. Eagle 1 to all stations, escalation pattern detected. Aircraft showing early signs of control system interference. Captain Rodriguez, monitoring the communications from his F-16, immediately increased his readiness level. Mountain Home Control, Viper 2-1, request permission to close distance and prepare for emergency escort procedures. Viper 2-1, permission granted. Close to visual distance and stand by for further instructions. In the United Airlines cockpit, Captain James Parker and First Officer Maria Rodriguez began noticing the same subtle control anomalies that had plagued Flight 2847. Parker had been specifically briefed about the electronic warfare threat and recognized the signs immediately. Maria, start the electronic interference checklist. I think we're being attacked, Parker said quietly to his co-pilot. First Officer Rodriguez began running through the newly developed procedures for suspected electronic warfare attacks while Captain Parker maintained manual control of the aircraft. They both knew that federal agents were aboard the flight, but they weren't told which passengers were operatives. Chicago Center, United 1847, were experiencing possible electronic interference with our flight management systems. Request priority handling and notification of protective assets. United 1847, Chicago Center, roger your transmission. Be advised you have military escort available. Protective assets are being activated. Sarah could feel the aircraft's behavior changing as Kozlov's attacks became more intensive. But, unlike her first experience, she now understood what was happening and felt some measure of control. Her equipment was recording everything, providing crucial intelligence that would help protect future flights. More importantly, she realized that her presence on the flight was actively contributing to passenger safety. The data she was gathering allowed ground controllers to understand the attack in real time and coordinate appropriate responses. Eagle 1 to base, attack intensity increasing. Recommend immediate intervention authorization. Agent Torres's response came quickly. Eagle 1, you are authorized to activate countermeasures. Initiate Protocol 7. Sarah had been trained in basic electronic countermeasures, including the use of jamming devices that could disrupt Kozlov's attacks without affecting the aircraft's legitimate systems. She discreetly activated the countermeasure device hidden in her laptop bag. The effect was immediate. Kozlov's tablet screen flickered, and she saw his frustrated expression as his attack software failed to maintain its connections with the aircraft's systems. The subtle control problems that had been developing began to subside as Sarah's jamming device blocked his electronic intrusion. But Kozlov was more sophisticated than Sarah had expected. Within minutes, he had adjusted his attack frequencies and begun circumventing her countermeasures. The electronic warfare battle playing out inside the passenger cabin represented cutting-edge technology on both sides. Base Eagle 1, countermeasures partially effective but subject is adapting. Request additional support. Captain Rodriguez, now flying close enough to visually observe the United Airlines flight, received authorization to activate military-grade electronic countermeasures from his F-16. The fighter aircraft carried sophisticated electronic warfare equipment that could protect civilian aircraft from exactly this type of attack. United 1847, this is Air Force Viper 2-1. I am activating protective electronic countermeasures. You should experience improvement in your control systems within 60 seconds. The military countermeasures were far more powerful than Sarah's portable devices. As Captain Rodriguez activated his aircraft's electronic warfare systems, Kozlov's tablet suddenly went completely dark. The attack on United Flight 1847 was effectively neutralized. But the operation was far from over. As soon as Kozlov realized his equipment had failed, he began looking around the cabin with obvious suspicion. Sarah pretended to be absorbed in her own work, but she could feel his eyes scanning the passengers, trying to identify who might be responsible for the interference. Eagle 1 to base, subject shows awareness of countermeasures. Maybe attempting to identify operative presence. Agent Torres responded with concern in her voice. Eagle 1, maintain cover but prepare for possible extraction. Subject may attempt to identify and neutralize opposition assets. What happened next surprised everyone involved in the operation. Instead of becoming hostile or attempting to identify the source of the interference, Kozlov calmly shut down his tablet and placed it in his bag. He then pulled out a book and began reading as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah continued observing him for the remainder of the flight, but he showed no further interest in electronic devices or suspicious activities. It was as if the entire attack had been a controlled test, and once his systems were neutralized, he simply moved on to other activities. Eagle 1 to base, subject has ceased all electronic activities and appears to be maintaining normal passenger behavior. Unclear if this represents mission completion or tactical withdrawal. The flight landed safely in Los Angeles with no further incidents. As passengers began deplaning, Sarah maintained visual contact with Kozlov while coordinating with ground agents who would take over surveillance once they left the aircraft. Captain Rodriguez's F-16 made a flyover of LAX before returning to base, his mission complete but with new questions about the scope and sophistication of the electronic warfare threat facing civilian aviation. As Sarah walked through the terminal, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 3 weeks. The terrified passenger who had barely survived Flight 2847 had become an active participant in protecting other travelers from similar attacks. But Agent Torres was waiting with news that would challenge Sarah even further. The intelligence gathered from Kozlov's activities had revealed something alarming. He was part of a cell preparing for a major coordinated attack on American aviation infrastructure. The probing flights had been preparation for something far more devastating. Eagle 1, we need to discuss your next assignment, Agent Torres said as they met in a secure area of the airport. The intelligence you've gathered is crucial, but we believe the real attack is still coming. Sarah looked at her handler with growing understanding. Her accidental involvement in stopping Flight 2847's emergency had evolved into something much larger. She was no longer just helping with a single investigation, she had become a key operative in preventing what could be a devastating attack on the American transportation system. "What kind of attack are we talking about?" Sarah asked. Agent Torres's expression was grave. "Based on the patterns we've observed, we believe they're planning to simultaneously attack multiple flights during peak travel periods. If successful, it could ground the entire commercial aviation industry and cause massive economic and psychological damage." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders as she realized that her unique position as an apparently ordinary business traveler made her one of the most valuable assets in preventing this attack. The nervous medical equipment saleswoman had become something she never could have imagined, a frontline operative in the defense of American aviation. Her transformation into Eagle One was complete, but the most dangerous phase of her mission was yet to come. 6 weeks after the United Flight 1847 operation, intelligence analysts had identified the target date for the coordinated attack, December 15, the Friday before Christmas week, one of the busiest travel days of the year. Sarah Martinez, now operating under the call sign Eagle One, found herself at the center of the most complex aviation security operation in American history. The task force had grown to include representatives from every major federal agency, military branches, and international partners. Colonel Williams now commanded a joint operations center at Peterson Air Force Base, where real-time intelligence from multiple sources painted a disturbing picture of the planned attack. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Williams addressed the assembled team, "we have confirmed intelligence that hostile operatives plan to simultaneously target 12 commercial flights across the continental United States. The attacks will begin at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and escalate over a 4-hour period." Sarah sat in the briefing room surrounded by FBI agents, Air Force pilots, cyber warfare specialists, and aviation security experts. 3 months earlier, she had been afraid to board a simple business flight. Now she was helping plan the defense of the entire American aviation system. Agent Torres continued the briefing. "Eagle One will be aboard American Flight 2156 from Atlanta to Seattle, which we believe is the primary target. Viktor Kozlov and 2 additional operatives have been identified on the passenger manifest for this flight." The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Sarah would board the flight with concealed countermeasure equipment while military aircraft provided protective escort for all 12 targeted flights. Ground-based electronic warfare units would stand ready to jam attacking signals, but the primary defense would come from operatives like Sarah working inside the targeted aircraft. Captain Rodriguez, now designated as flight lead for the military escort operation, outlined the aerial component. "We'll have F-16 pairs assigned to each targeted flight, with additional assets on standby. Each escort team will carry advanced electronic warfare packages specifically designed to counter the attack frequencies we've identified." The sophistication of the defense operation rivaled anything typically reserved for protecting Air Force One. Commercial aviation had never before received this level of military protection, reflecting the serious nature of the threat intelligence had uncovered. Sarah's training for this mission had been intensive. She now carried equipment that represented the cutting edge of portable electronic warfare technology, disguised as ordinary business electronics. Her laptop contained countermeasure systems that could protect an entire aircraft from electronic attack, while her smartphone housed communication gear that connected her directly to the Joint Operations Center. "Eagle One," Agent Torres said as they reviewed final preparations, "remember that you're not just protecting one flight. The intelligence you gather and the countermeasures you deploy will be coordinated with all 12 operations simultaneously." The morning of December 15 began early for Sarah as she prepared for what everyone hoped would be the conclusion of the electronic warfare threat to American aviation. She dressed in her standard business attire, looking exactly like the thousands of other travelers who would be flying that day, but carrying technology and responsibility that set her apart from every other passenger in the country. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Sarah went through normal security procedures while being discreetly monitored by federal agents positioned throughout the terminal. The modified electronics in her bags had been specifically designed to pass through airport security systems without detection. Viktor Kozlov and his 2 associates were also in the terminal, though they appeared to be traveling separately and showed no obvious signs of coordination. Sarah had studied their files extensively and could identify each of them on sight, but she maintained careful distance to avoid arousing their suspicion. Captain Rodriguez was already airborne in his F-16, part of a massive but invisible military operation that stretched across the continental United States. 12 pairs of fighter aircraft were positioned to escort the targeted flights, while additional electronic warfare aircraft maintained strategic positions to provide broad-spectrum jamming if needed. Mountain Home Control, Viper Lead, all escort flights are in position and ready for protective operations, Rodriguez reported to the Joint Operations Center. Colonel Williams monitored the operation from Peterson Air Force Base, where banks of computers displayed the real-time positions of all targeted flights, escort aircraft, and known hostile operatives. The scope of the defensive operation was unprecedented in aviation history. American Flight 2156 began boarding at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, with Sarah among the first passengers to board using her frequent flyer status. She took her assigned seat in row 8, which provided good sightlines to monitor the 3 suspected operatives while appearing to be focused on her own activities. As other passengers filed aboard, Sarah activated her concealed monitoring equipment and began scanning for the electronic signatures that would indicate the presence of attack devices. Her equipment immediately detected multiple sources of sophisticated electronics beyond the normal passenger devices like phones and tablets. Eagle 1 to base, multiple electronic signatures detected consistent with attack profiles. Subjects appear to be carrying coordinated equipment packages. The response from the operations center was immediate. Eagle 1, understood. All escort flights are now in attack formation. Prepare to initiate countermeasures on your signal. As Flight 2156 taxied for departure, similar scenes were playing out at airports across the country. 11 other flights carrying suspected electronic warfare operatives were being monitored by additional agents while military aircraft took protective positions. The first sign of attack came as Flight 2156 reached cruising altitude. Sarah felt the subtle aircraft movements that had become familiar during her previous encounters with electronic warfare. But, this time, the attacks were far more sophisticated and intensive than anything she had experienced before. Kozlov and his associates were working in coordination, each targeting different aircraft systems simultaneously. One focused on navigation systems, another on flight management computers, while the third attacked the flight control systems directly. The combined assault represented a level of sophistication that exceeded worst-case intelligence estimates. Eagle 1 to base, coordinated multi-vector attack in progress. Intensity far beyond previous encounters. Initiating full countermeasures. Sarah activated her most powerful defensive systems while Captain Rodriguez positioned his F-16 for maximum effectiveness of his aircraft's electronic warfare capabilities. But even their combined efforts were only partially successful against the sustained assault from 3 coordinated attackers. In the cockpit, Captain Lisa Thompson and First Officer David Martinez were fighting to maintain control of their aircraft as multiple systems came under simultaneous attack. They had been specifically trained for this scenario, but the reality was more challenging than any simulation. Atlanta Center, American 2156, we are under intensive electronic attack. All flight systems are experiencing interference. Request immediate assistance. The response came from the Joint Operations Center, American 2156, military assistance is active. Maintain manual control and prepare for enhanced countermeasures. What happened next demonstrated the full scope of the defensive operation that had been prepared for this moment. Captain Rodriguez activated not just his F-16's electronic warfare systems, but coordinated with a EC-130 electronic warfare aircraft that had been standing by at high altitude. The EC-130 Compass Call aircraft carried electronic warfare capabilities that dwarfed anything available on the smaller fighter jets. When it directed its full power at the frequencies being used by the attackers, the effect was devastating to their equipment. Sarah watched in fascination as all 3 operatives' devices suddenly failed simultaneously. Kozlov looked around the cabin with obvious alarm as his sophisticated attack system went completely dark. His associates showed similar confusion as their coordinated assault was neutralized by military-grade countermeasures. Eagle 1 to base, all hostile electronic activity has ceased. Military countermeasures appear fully effective. But the celebration was premature. Unknown to Sarah or the Joint Operations Center, the three operatives on Flight 2156 were carrying backup systems specifically designed to counter military electronic warfare defenses. Within minutes of their primary systems failing, they activated secondary attack packages that operated on entirely different frequencies. The renewed assault was even more intense than the first wave. Flight 2156 began experiencing severe control problems as the attackers focused all their energy on disabling the aircraft's fly-by-wire systems. Captain Thompson found herself fighting for control as the aircraft pitched and rolled unpredictably. American 2156, emergency declared, Captain Thompson transmitted with strain evident in her voice. We are losing control authority. Systems are failing faster than we can compensate. Sarah realized that her portable countermeasures were insufficient against the backup attack systems. The electronic warfare battle inside the passenger cabin required more drastic action. She made a decision that went beyond her training and authorization. Moving carefully through the cabin during a moment when the aircraft's erratic movements provided cover, Sarah approached Kozlov's row from behind. Using techniques learned during her crash course in field operations, she attached a small device to his laptop bag that would directly interfere with his equipment at close range. The effect was immediate. Kozlov's backup system failed, and Sarah quickly moved to the other two operatives, neutralizing their devices with similar direct action. But her activities had not gone unnoticed. "You," Kozlov said in accented English as Sarah passed his row on her way back to her seat. "You are not ordinary passenger." Sarah's cover was blown, but her mission was complete. All three attack systems had been neutralized, and Flight 2150's access control problems immediately began to subside as the electronic assault ended. Eagle 1 to base, all hostile systems neutralized through direct action. Cover is compromised but immediate threat is eliminated. Captain Rodriguez, monitoring the communications from his F-16 escort position, immediately coordinated with the operations center. Base, Viper lead, recommend immediate priority landing for American 2156. Eagle 1 may be in danger from hostile operatives. The decision was made to divert Flight 2156 to the nearest major airport, which was Charlotte Douglas International. Emergency services were alerted, and federal agents prepared to board the aircraft as soon as it landed to arrest the three electronic warfare operatives. But the mission aboard Flight 2156 was only one part of a much larger operation. Across the country, similar battles were being fought on 11 other flights as hostile operatives attempted to execute their coordinated attack on American aviation. The defensive operation was largely successful. Military escorts and onboard countermeasures prevented most of the attacks from causing serious control problems. But 3 flights experienced significant difficulties, and 1 was forced to make an emergency landing in Denver with partial flight control failure. As Flight 2156 touched down in Charlotte, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a nervous passenger barely surviving an unexpected emergency. Now she was the central figure in preventing what could have been the most devastating attack on American aviation in history. Federal agents boarded the aircraft immediately after landing and arrested Viktor Kozlov and his 2 associates without incident. The electronic warfare devices they carried were seized as evidence, providing valuable intelligence about the sophisticated nature of the threat that had been neutralized. Eagle 1, Agent Torres said as she met Sarah at the gate, "You've done something remarkable. The intelligence and operational success from today's mission has effectively ended this electronic warfare threat to commercial aviation." Captain Rodriguez's F-16 made a final flyover of Charlotte Airport before returning to base. His role in the day's operation had been crucial, but he knew that the real hero was the civilian operative who had voluntarily placed herself in danger to protect other passengers. Colonel Williams later described the December 15 operation as a watershed moment in aviation security. The successful defense against coordinated electronic warfare attacks demonstrated that civilian and military authorities could work together effectively to protect commercial aviation from sophisticated technological threats. For Sarah Martinez, the operation marked the end of her unexpected career as Eagle 1. She had accomplished something extraordinary, transforming from a fearful passenger into one of the most effective operatives in aviation security history. Her unique combination of cover identity, observational skills, and courage had made her irreplaceable in operations that no traditional agent could have accomplished. The nervous medical equipment saleswoman who had once dreaded flying had become the guardian angel of American aviation, protecting thousands of passengers from threats they would never know existed. Her call sign Eagle One would be remembered in classified files as representing the highest traditions of civilian service to national security. As she finally returned home to Boulder, Colorado, Sarah knew that her flying experiences would never again be routine. But her fear of aviation had been replaced by something far more powerful: the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded heroism. The woman who had once been merely a passenger had become legend.